Hello everyone. Welcome to Hack in the Box. Can everyone hear me properly right now? Yeah. Awesome. So, hi everyone. My name is Ryan Shepherd. I'm from Countercept, which is an MWR info security company. For those of you that may have heard of the company itself, we recently got acquired by F-Secure, so we're still working through our identity right now. But I'll just say that I'm from Countercept for now. This is going to be my talk, a year in purple, which is going to revolve around the topic of purple teaming in general. But to be honest, it's going to be everything sort of like offensive and defensive related and everything in between, because this past year and a half, I've experienced quite a bit, and the best way for me to put it is to put it under the umbrella of purple teaming in general. But as you'll find, as we go through the talk, we'll be going into some detail on the offensive side and then going back to the defensive side and hopping back and forth. So I hope you can bear with me. I'm also going to be trying a sort of new presentation style from the one that I'm used to, mainly because I found that while talking about these topics, which I'm really passionate about, if I try to formalize the talk too much, it loses some of my ability to talk to you about these things. So please bear with me if as I get used to this new presentation style. But anyway, moving forward, a bit about myself and who I am. So again, just like my company is working its way through its sort of new identity, I myself in the past year have had to decide on where I fall on the security professional spectrum. Because I've been involved in many different areas. My official title right now is a detection and response investigator for Countercept. Before that, it was a threat hunter, which I've done talks on before. I'm also a purple team consultant, working on purple team projects, which as you'll see is sort of the perfect combination, to involve people from, all aspects of the industry. And this past year, it's been a privilege to work in that sort of environment, and I'm hoping to share some of these experiences with you. I also try to recommend being trained both offensively and defensively with certain certifications, as long as they are useful. As I've come to understand, it's quite difficult nowadays to actually find certifications that help you train for the things that I'm about to talk about today. But my solution to this is to actually show you how myself and my team have done it and how some people in the industry are doing it, so that you can get involved as well. So a quick overview of the agenda for today. The talk is going to be separated into two main areas. First one being case studies of a select number of investigations. Those are going to cover sort of an attack detection related investigations, and then we're going to move to incident response focused investigations and comparing them to advanced persistent threat investigations and red team exercises. We're then going to be moving to attack and defense simulation and talking about purple teaming in general and how it mirrors what is being done in the industry today when you're working in environments where you're doing investigations, you're doing attack detection, you're doing compromise assessments, and how it's all coming together, and how it's going to look in the future. And part of that is going to be talking about a project that I've been working on for the past year, which is an attack and defense simulation lab. So I'll be giving you an overview of that from a particular lab that was built by someone in our team, and then also giving you an insight into some of the things that are being done in the open source community for you to have access to and play with. And hopefully that should wrap up everything that I need to talk about within an hour. So without further ado, right, so I'm going to go through the first bit, which is going to be investigations that were done from an attack an attack detection perspective. Now, this is the team that I'm currently working in. The people that I work with again, have been involved in several parts of the industry, but right now we're focused on the attack detection part for particular reasons. And one of the main reasons is the fact that, as I've mentioned before this, I was working mainly as a threat hunter. Now you may be asking, what's the difference? And that's been one of the main challenges, is to differentiate between the subtle differences between doing attack detection, doing threat hunting, doing incident response, and finding a way to convey the differences to the community is one of the main challenges that needs to be solved before we're able to find a way to evolve this area of the industry. So as I go through these case studies, try to keep that in mind. If you feel like a lot of it has overlap between different terms that I use, that's the reason why, but I'll do my best to differentiate between them. So a key principle that I want you to keep in mind, that I like to talk about before I go into these things, is the fact that with traditional detection, as most people are aware of it, you usually start with some sort of technology, right? You buy a certain product, a certain security product, you put it onto your estate, and it's supposed to do what it does for you and provide most of the solution. And then there's people behind it that are using this technology. So you start with the technology and then you use people. Now with threat hunting, with attack detection, and with the way things are moving forward, you actually start with the right kind of people, the people that have a certain skill set and a certain level of experience, and you then use them to drive the technology forward. And the reason why this is a key principle is because from what I've experienced, the level of technology that is at your disposal is not the limiting factor when doing investigations and when tracking attacks, because over and over again, I found myself in situations where I didn't have access to the technology that I needed at the time, but I overcame that simply by relying on the knowledge and the experience that I have to find the bare minimum that I needed to achieve the goal that I needed to, which in the realm of attack detection is to contain an incident and shut down the attacker. So the cases that we're going to go through is going to exemplify that in a way that is like when this incident came about, it presented itself in this way, and once it was over, I realized just how perfect it was to embody this principle and to explain it to people. So to give you an idea of the context in which it happened, basically we investigated the same infection in both cases, but the investigation itself happened twice in the space of 1 week, and it was performed by 2 different teams. Now, the first team, which I was involved in, and myself and another colleague, in our case, the host that we were investigating was actually offline. So we were hunting through the historical data for that estate, and we found something on this particular host, but it was offline, which meant that the entire technology stack that was supposed to oversee this host was offline, and we didn't have access to it. But we still needed to resolve this incident, find out what happened, and communicate with the client to contain it. You'll see one of the main differences between the two is the amount of time that it took to complete this investigation. In our case, it took about 2 hours. A week later, when the second team came along and found the same infection, but didn't realize that it was the same infection because they were doing a completely different hunt themselves. As you see, we started off looking at partial activity. They were looking at reflective loads in memory. But sort of halfway through their investigation, they realized that this was something that the team that was investigating this the week previous was actually looking at the same thing. So as we go through, you'll start to realize how this came together. So the first investigation, which is the one that I was involved in, which was where the host was actually offline. This is a sort of timeline that was the sequence of events that was involved from start to finish within that 2-hour period. So as I said, we started off doing a normal hunt of the day sort of scenario where we picked a certain data set to look through to find if there was anything suspicious going on. In that case, we were focused on PowerShell, and this came up. Now, depending on your level of experience in attack detection, especially when it comes to PowerShell, this is a pretty standard command that may or may not be used genuinely, but some of the telltale signs that this is malicious is the fact that this is downloading and executing a payload from the 204.16 IP, which is the C2 server. Now, the fact that it's referencing a direct IP and not a domain, for example, or an internal IP, which is the way that most sysadmins actually use PowerShell to carry out this sort of command, tells you that this is going to be malicious. And the fact that it's referencing a port and then the sort of vague-looking payload at the end of it. So from that point, we don't know what the payload is. We don't know anything about what happened before or after. But the key thing that we realized is that, like I said, the host was offline. So we had to figure out a way to not rely on the technology itself and just rely on what we knew how to do at the time to get the job done. So as soon as this came about, one of the key things that I'm going to be referring to as we go through this is the time factor when it comes to doing this in real time, right? So we can talk about these things in theory or after the fact with hindsight, but the fact is that when these things are happening in real time, the time factor is something that's rarely talked about, because the usual example that's given is that defenders are at a disadvantage because they only have one chance to catch the attacker, whereas the attacker has many opportunities and as much time as they need to actually find a way through, right? But this is actually something that, as we've been trying to overcome that challenge, especially in the past year, there's been several examples where this time factor can actually be turned to the defender's advantage, and at the very least, finding ways to mitigate the fact that this is a disadvantage for you. So in this case, the fact that I was working with a colleague of mine at the time, so we were together working on this investigation, meant that, number one, we could split the responsibilities in terms of prioritizing the things that we needed to do. And off the get-go, that halves the time that it takes to reach completion. But within the context of this investigation, the fact that, like I said, we didn't have access to the technology that we needed to, meant that there was an added pressure on our minds to get this done whichever way we could. So the first thing that we went on to do was, I decided to go down the C2 discovery route, getting as much information about the IP that was listed in the PowerShell command, and then digging down on getting as much information from that as possible. On the other hand, the colleague that I was working with decided to go down the route of retrieving the sample directly from the C2 server itself, going through Tor. Now, this process takes longer and is less security conscious than what the technology that we had at hand would have allowed. Because if we had access to the endpoint agent on the host itself, we could do these things safely and much more quickly. But in this case, doing these things the manual way took about twice as long. But it was interesting to see how the process of getting to the same information that you needed to move the investigation along actually looked like. So at this stage, we managed to get the payload straight from the C2 server. And what was surprising there is that usually the attackers, once they've set up a C2 server, they can go down the route of actually being very selective of which hosts are allowed to connect to it and download the payloads. It's not often that you'll find that the server is open for anyone to go and download the payload itself. And once we realized that we were able to get the payload and the server was open, it meant that the information that was available about the attacker's infrastructure on my end when I was investigating it, we already had a much more information than we anticipated. So it helped us overcome some of the challenges that we had for not having access to the host on our technology stack. So the next step was to prioritize recognizing what the persistence and infection vector was, because as soon as you identify that, you're well on your way to contain the infection itself. Now, the only thing that we had at our disposal at that time was the historical data for that host. So the main things that we started looking through was any sort of browser or browsing data that was involved for this host previously. And usually from our experience, like these things that we saw up until now in terms of the PowerShell and the IP that we saw suggested that this was likely to be related to a phishing campaign. So as we went back, we prioritized looking at things like Outlook or things coming from email clients. And this is what we ended up finding in the first entry there, which was the download of this weird-looking PDF.scr file, which is made to look like a PDF file, but it's actually an SCR file, which, as some of you may know, is a Windows executable and can run executable code. So this was launched through Outlook, through Internet Explorer. So this suggests that this was a phishing email that was opened by the user. Now, the next entry is actually a user assist entry which suggested that the user actually clicked on this file himself. It wasn't any sort of automated process whereby the payload was downloaded and then automatically ran. And the next entry is this reg svcs program, which is running an unknown binary at this point in the temp folder, which is then running this payload that was downloaded. So at this point, you have some pieces of the puzzle, but you still need to fully understand how they fit together. And without, again, thinking about the time factor that's involved here and the fact that you don't have access to the technology that's supposed to help you visualize these things, you're doing it sort of all in your head and in a very manual way. The main things to point out here is that we have an unknown binary that we haven't seen before, which is the fqf.exe in the temp folder, but it's running the SCR file, which was obtained from the phishing email. So how do these things sort of fit together? So the best way for us to start getting more information around this was to continue the second avenue of investigation, which started with retrieving the sample from the C2 server itself, which was what my colleague was working on. So that was the next step, and he managed to get the payload itself and decode it, and we ended up finding a reference to this PowerShell script on an open source GitLab, which was referencing a script which was used to perform reflective loading in memory using PowerShell. Now, at this point, if the host was online, we would have had access to the scanners that were looking at memory, and we would have been able to confirm whether this actually took place on the host or not. Now, because this wasn't the case, the best we could do was to actually try and look at how this script works just by reading the code, and then trying to figure out what would have happened before this event and what it's supposed to be doing as its next step. The other screenshot is just referencing the C2 server that was referenced in the PowerShell command, but in this case, it's showing that it's serving files on other ports. So this is an example of things which you pick up as you investigate, which might not be relevant to the primary path of investigation that you're on, but that you need to recognize and use right away to set up detection as you're doing investigation, because as you're looking into these things, you're actually putting a pause on your sort of live monitoring capabilities. Like you're assigning more resources to investigating this manually, and you're looking less at the data that's coming in. So, for example, knowing that this IP is serving things on specific ports can help you go back to your detection rules and feed that information back in so that, let's say the host does come back online at any moment, which it can at that point. We have no idea when this host might be coming back online. It might help us sort of fast things forward once the data comes in, and we already know what to look for. And this is going to be a recurring theme during these investigations, and being able to recognize these things and action them quickly can make all the difference when we talk about the time factor that you have, the time that you have to resolve this before the attacker gets to their objective. So, interestingly enough, as we were going through this, we came across this this reference at the top there, which makes absolutely no sense, but as we later found out, was simply a reference to the SCR file that was downloaded. Now, I put this down as a missing link because I found it interesting that when you're in the heat of the moment and you're actually focused on investigating these things, you sometimes miss some of the most obvious clues that are there, because like your mind can play tricks on you. When we saw this, I remember clearly the first thing that my colleague said to me was that, as he overlooked this, he said this might be like a network share of some kind that's referencing this really weird looking file. And with hindsight, it was probably like like the most far-fetched thing to say at that point, because this is a user assist entry. And so basic knowledge would tell you that Windows encodes this with a ROT13 encoding salt. So the fact that you just put a ROT13 and it gives you the answer right there it seems rather simple. But as we were going through this, it was one thing that just stayed on our mind and we just couldn't figure out. And when we realized just how simple it is, I just found it interesting to mention that during these investigations, you can run into these situations where something rather simple is just nagging you and not letting go of your attention, and you only figure out what it was, at the end of it. So I'm going to quickly move on to how the second team did it, just as a way of comparing and contrasting how it compares to the one that we did. So in that case, like I said, the host was online, so they were looking at reflective load data. Now, if you remember, part of the things we figured out in the first investigation was that they were using a script which was used to reflectively load into a process using PowerShell. So in this case, the second team, this is the anomalous event that they picked up, which is a reflective load into the reg SVCS program. Now, one thing we didn't realize at the time was what this reg SVCS program was actually used for. Now, it's part of the .NET framework, and it can actually register .NET COM objects which can execute arbitrary code. And even more than that, it can execute code within processes that might not have the privilege that's required, simply because part of its registering and unregistering attributes, if I'm correct, actually allows you to execute that code beyond the privilege that the process is in. So this is something that we didn't know at the time, but keeping it in mind now as we go through is going to be interesting. So their next course of action, because they had access to the technology, was completely different. So they were able to identify the process threads that were associated with that reflective load. So we know what process was involved. They were looking at the threads that were associated with it, and they were also looking at the network tracing data that was coming in live to basically see if any of the connections that we picked up from for example, from the PowerShell command that we were going through, any of the IPs, any of the network connections that were involved with that were turning up. And because they had access to the endpoint agent, they were able to retrieve the process dump rather quickly to get to the information that we were trying to get to, but right away without having to sort of go the long way around it. Now, once they picked up the process dump, they already had the information from the process threads data set to know exactly which part of the memory to look for and which part of it they were supposed to carve to retrieve the payload. Now, at this point, we don't actually know what is being reflectively loaded into that process. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what reflective loading is, it's a process injection technique which involves mapping a DLL into the memory of a given process, but without actually having to send the DLL to disk first and then write it to the process. It just maps it directly into memory. So it bypasses a lot of the disk signaturing capabilities that some security products have. And in fact, some of the more advanced ways of doing it can even bypass some of the current memory scanning capabilities, which is something that we've been researching quite a lot in the last 3 months, and at some point we will be doing a presentation on. But in any case, the fact that this was reflectively loading something we didn't know about was the next step of the investigation to sort of figure out as soon as possible. And at this point, those guys didn't know that this had been investigated before, keep in mind. So the sequence of events that they're going through is happening much more quickly, but they're still having to figure out the same answers that we had to figure out, but with lesser capability at our disposal. So some of the data that they were seeing had to do with the SCR file, which was launching this fqf.exe again. So if you remember in the first investigation, this fqf.exe was showing up and was being launched by the reg SVCS server service. Now, the reflective load happened into reg SVCS, so that's going to be the main thing to try and understand as soon as possible. One of the artifacts that was retrieved right away was the MFT, because this is more of a traditional like IR artifact that's retrieved during investigations, and might not have been required here. But the reason this was done was just in case the host was to come offline. So in our situation, the host was offline and it could have come back on at any moment, and we were ready to go back to a more traditional investigation path at that point. In their case, they have to take into account that the host can come offline at any moment, so they need to retrieve everything that they can while it's online. And this actually came in useful later on near the end of the investigation. Now, the host did go offline right after they confirmed that what was actually being reflectively loaded into the regis VCR process. So the missing link that they had to do with the SCR file. Like they still didn't know where the SCR file came from. This is something that we figured out in the previous investigation as having come from a phishing email. Now, the way they figured that out was once the host had gone offline, they went back to the MFT and looked at the first time that it was written to disk, and basically traced their way back to have a timeline to go back to the historical data and see exactly which processes were running as that file was being written to disk. And what they found was that Outlook was running. It opened Internet Explorer, and suddenly you had that file being written to disk. So to make more sense of this, because the first two parts was to explain the thought process and the investigative process that was involved in the two separate situations. The summary for what this infection was actually doing was that you had the phishing email being delivered. The user would then open Outlook and have the attachment there, would click on it, and he would download it to the host itself. Now, the SCR file, like I said, has executable code in there, and it had two parts to it. It had the part which executed the download of the second stage, which was the fqf.exe. Now, when we looked into what this binary was, it's a legitimate auto-IT scripting language binary. So think of it as just another genuine scripting language like PowerShell. It can be used maliciously or genuinely. In this case, some of the more like generic malware that's out there likes to use auto-IT. So this was what the fqf.exe was in this case. Now, the first thing that it did was that it used the fqf.exe to execute the auto-IT script, which was embedded within the SCR file, and connect to the C2 server that we saw right at the beginning to pull down the PowerShell script. Now, that PowerShell script was used to reflectively load into the REST service process, and that was picked because of the characteristics that we spoke about, the fact that it could execute code beyond its privileges, and the persistence that was used in our case was an autorun was created on the host itself to make sure that this auto-IT script could be run over and over again. In the second investigation, what was interesting was the autorun wasn't present, and this sort of made us question why we weren't seeing that, even though from what we could tell, the attack hadn't necessarily completed because the host went offline, like I said, in the middle of the investigation. But he should have created the autorun at that point. And one thing that another colleague of ours, which was just looking at the investigation as we were documenting it, pointed out, is that this particular host was never being shut down, right? So he would either be on or he would go to sleep. And that meant that all the process data for it was basically saying that the host never went, the process never had a stop time. It never stopped. They were always running, which suggested that the attackers realized what sort of host they were on and the fact that it had this specific characteristic. And they didn't need to go down the route of dropping more artifacts on the host like an autorun to create persistence. They were just relying on the fact that this host is not even shutting down completely and cutting off our access. So this is another example of things which you may miss as you're trying to contain the incident as fast as possible, but it's very key in understanding the capabilities that are there with the malware that you're investigating. And when we finished containing the incident and then looked at the binary more closely, this is a sort of list of capabilities that it had. Now, one of the most recurring questions that we have with clients when reporting any sort of incident to them is they're interested in knowing what this particular piece of malware can do that we reported, right? And it's one of the most difficult questions to answer correctly for the client, because when we look at this is listing all sorts of things that it can do. Now, it doesn't mean that it actually used all of these capabilities. It might have used like one or two of them. So the key is not figuring out what the malware can do, is figuring out what the malware actually did based on the capabilities that it had. In this case, we definitely, one of the ones that you will always do is try and figure out what sort of environment it's in to determine what sort of capabilities it can use. Later on, we realized that it was keylogging the systems that it was on and creating files with passwords and credentials in there. The fact that it was hooking processes, we already know that it had process injection capabilities. But any of the other ones, like capturing screenshots or sniffing audio, like those ones are typical of remote access tool malware. But you'd rarely come across malware activating like activating the camera capability or trying to pick up the audio around the computer itself. I've personally never come across it. But when you mention this to clients, they start to panic around some of the implications of these capabilities. And it's why going beyond understanding what the malware can do is so important. One thing I'll lastly mention for this one is the comparison between the two investigations that were done for this same infection. I mentioned the time factor in this case, and the objective that we were trying to reach was to get back to the client and tell them that this was contained. In the first one, it was rather easy because the host was already offline, and the first thing we could tell them is to make sure that it doesn't come back online until we finish our investigation. In the second case, it was online and it could go offline at any moment, but the time it would take to actually for the client to respond to this was more than the time it would take us to finish the investigation, and that time was more than what the attacker needed to get to their objective. So the level of priorities that you have to take into account with time is something that I'll keep pointing to, and hopefully this exposed it in this particular way. The next one we're going to be going to is a more incident response focused, and in that sort of environment, it takes on a completely different form. So this next sort of case study is going to look at it from an incident response perspective, but something that we've been doing in the past year is actually responding with incident response. So the attack detection team would come in and support the IR team during their investigations, because the typical way that we engage with the client is that a client will get compromised. They'll call up an incident response hotline. The incident response team will take their details, work through the process, and maybe send someone on site or start the investigation in some way. But one of the key advantages that being able to work together alongside an attack detection team is that it changes the whole status quo around IR, which is you call incident response because you're already compromised and the attackers already, come onto your estate and achieve their objective. So one of the most dramatic changes that incident response has been going through is actually moving closer to attack detection in what they're doing, because they're no longer responding to an incident once it's over. They're doing it while it's happening, while the attacker is on the estate. So the question is, how is that any different from doing attack detection, right? And a lot of it comes down to the technology and the responsibilities that are assigned to the people that are involved in each team. Because what we realize is that the skill set is the same, the experience is pretty much the same. It only comes down to how you prioritize what you need to do to contain the incident, which is why I'm going to explain how an incident response focused incident looks like, so you can compare it to the attack detection one. But then also the fact that when you are in a situation where you cannot take advantage of an attack detection team to support your investigation when you're in incident response, how does that look like when you're doing it in a live situation compared to something like a red team exercise? Now, the red team exercise there plays a certain role, and I'm including it because as we're going to go on to talk about attack and defense simulation, this is probably red team exercises are probably the one thing that some of you who work in different roles or even work as red teamers will be familiar about. What you might not hear about often is how these things are investigated as they're happening, because they don't happen in a vacuum. When red team exercises are booked for a company, if they have a security solution, is to test that security solution, right? And because we're not dealing simply with some sort of technology stack that's being benchmarked or any sort of compliance related process for the purpose of this red team, we're actually looking at what we can learn from an attack detection perspective, from a defensive perspective, when having the opportunity to cover a red team exercise. And then comparing that to when a real attack is happening, and the difference are very slight, it's just how you respond to them. So the case study that I'm going to cover is a banking incident that happened where attackers got away with millions of dollars, and the bank ended up calling incident response. They came in and did an investigation for about a month, and then realized that because of how open the estate was, and the fact that there was a good chance that the attacker were actually going to come back at some point, they decided to bring along the attack detection team and to roll out the managed detection and response service on that estate. Now, the focus is not the fact that the service was rolled out on this, it's the people that were working on this. So, like I said, the incident response team was already in there, and the level of information that we got at the point where we got involved was that basically this was the sort of infrastructure that we were focused on. So the attackers were trying to find a way to cash out as much money as they could in the simplest way. Up until that point, if you know anything about credit card fraud or the way that attackers attack banks, they'll usually be targeting specific switches, so things to do with debit cards, credit cards, or prepaid gift cards switches, because the information that the place from which you get this information is directly related to hacks that have to do with compromising databases that hold the information for these things. And so you just simply buy this information and then use it to cash out within a period of time that's short enough for the bank not to realize that this is fraudulent transactions. The problem with that is that once bank realized that this was happening, they adapted as well, right? So they put controls in place to make sure that these methods would not be viable anymore. So attackers had to adapt again, and this time they moved up the chain to the generic transaction switch, which is the switch that decides which type of switch the transaction will go to next. And one of the key things that it does at that point is the authentication process. So things like your card PIN, your personal information that's related to the transaction that's coming through. If it's your card, if you're doing like business to business, is something like more of a SWIFT system where they have different levels of authentication there. The point here is that the attacker's goal was to attack the application that was running on that switch. So it was like a custom application that they had no idea how it worked, but they just knew that it was there and they needed to get to it in order to penetration test it or try to break it in the way that a normal penetration test would. When you get an application, you just try to find vulnerabilities in there. Now keep that in mind, because when we're going to talk about how long this attack actually took, it's interesting to understand that this was their first layer objective. The secondary objective was to actually, once they got to the application, was to find vulnerabilities in there. And once they found the vulnerabilities, was to do it in such a way that allowed them to cash out infinite money. And at that point, once IR came in, they'd already managed to do that once and get away with about $40 million. But we're just going to quickly, this is the context, and now we're just going to go through how they actually got their first foothold on this estate. But keep in mind what the objective was as we go through that. So if you go back to the first part of the talk when we talked about the two case studies that we covered from an attack detection perspective, the first steps of the attack in this case was something that's much more sophisticated and much more targeted. It's still the same. It's still trying to find a foothold onto the client's estate, and that's, from my experience, there's not much variation in that regard. The goal is the same. It's only a matter of time and how much resources you can throw at this process. So the first thing they're going to target is the corporate network, where you have just normal everyday users. In this case, that's what they did, and the way they compromised that user, they used malware that's just as generic as the things which we covered in the first part of the talk. It doesn't need to be sophisticated. Even when you go, let's say on the darknet, and you go and look at some of the services that are offered when it comes to buying sophisticated malware to get to do this sort of thing, the value proposition is, when you look at the pricing of these things, makes you realize that even the attackers understand that this first step doesn't need to be sophisticated at all, because it's just a case of having enough time to get through. So they compromised a given user on the corporate network, found someone who was part of the management group, started out mapping the attack path to get to the transaction switch group that they were interested in. Interestingly enough, they didn't need to go down the typical route of getting domain admin on the estate. And this is something that's like the go-to objective that you think the attackers are going to go for just because it gives them full access. In this case, it seemed that they were smart enough to map out an attack path where they didn't need to compromise the entire domain and then create their own access. They were literally trying to fly under the radar using already existing attack paths and using groups that already existed and users that already existed. So this is just to understand the attack path. Now the timeline for when these things happened, this is based on information that we got after the fact, but it's interesting because again, it illustrates the time factor that I mentioned, and I'm going to go back between these two slides as we go through it. So if you go back to the first part of the talk, you're dealing with sort of level 4, level 5, where the likelihood of dealing with those attacks is high. Like in my experience, it's what I deal with most of the time. Once you start going to level 3, 2, and 1, those things come up maybe like once or twice a month. You'll have like a big compromise that's super targeted, something you've never seen before. And the reason for that is because these attacks actually take a long time to orchestrate and to set up. And this is an example of how you can become aware of the fact that attackers have the same problem that defenders have when we talk about how much time they have to carry out their objectives. So in this case, to get to the part where they're cashing out, they need about 6 months, a 6-month period to actually get there. Now, how many opportunities do you think there are in that time for attack detection to pick up something, anything, just one clue to pull a thread on and actually uncover the whole thing before he gets to the objective? Because if you stop the attack at any of these stages, it doesn't matter that they got to the payment system or the fact that they learned the system or even weaponized it. At that point, they haven't actually done anything yet in terms of cashing out, right? So you've got this whole 6-month period to do it and to find something. In the case of the low-level threats, what you'll find is that they happen much more quickly. Like because it's generic, often it's automated. The sort of objective that it's trying to get to might be like to get a pair of credentials or gain some sort of information that's on the system. They don't even care what it is. They just want to get the information back and see if anything is valuable on there. So it's a quick in and out on the host that's affected, and the scope of it is not even that great. It might affect a small number of hosts, and you'll see it on there, and that's it. Like, that's the end of it. The thing is, you don't have that much time to actually stop the attack. A lot of the time, you rely on having very good detection on the earlier parts of the kill chain, where, let's say, in the case of the phishing email example, like as soon as that file gets onto the disk, you're already seeing its execution, and you can stop the rest of the execution chain to happen. But with APT groups, that's not going to be the case. So the part I wanted to focus on is learning the systems, right? So between September 10th and December 2nd, which is about like a 3-month period, that's how much time they needed to actually learn how that application was working, the generic transaction switch application. And if you look at how much time that is, it's your typical sort of penetration project time for an application to try and find as many vulnerabilities as you can in there. So they're following the same process as we are when we're doing application testing, but they're just doing it for different reasons. Like, once they find something, they're actually looking to use it to cash out. So the thing that we're looking for specifically here was to find a way for, once the transaction was coming in at the transaction switch, they didn't want any of the authentication to happen. They wanted to create a closed feedback loop where the transaction was coming in, but right away it was sending back an authorization code, so that the money mules that were going to the ATMs, they could literally use a blank card and put it in and cash out as much as they wanted without having any information on that card. The only thing they needed to program in there was like the bank that they were targeting. So the IBAN number was programmed into the card, and they would go to that bank's ATM and just cash out as much as was in the ATM at the time. So so going back to what I was saying, at this stage, once they weaponized it and they executed it, the attack detection team was brought in, and our goal was to make sure that the fact that it already happened suggested that they had access so they could come back at any moment. Our goal was to make sure that if they did come back, we would know about it before they got to the objective again. So the second time round, they did try and come back. By that time, we'd figured out the timeline. We figured out exactly what they used at which point. A lot of the generic stuff that was happening early on, the way they were getting their foothold on the estate, all of that was mapped out very similarly to how the first case studies were done. So the only thing we needed to do was to catch that, respond to it, and contain it. And what was surprising was that because of how effective it is, we were able to recognize that they had come back before they'd even compromised the first user, just because of the enumeration that they were doing, and we had information around that. So incident response came back again at that point and was going on site to respond to the incident, but they weren't doing it after the fact anymore. They weren't doing it once the incident had already happened. We started working together on giving them the information that we were seeing. They were going to the hosts that were affected, taking all the artifacts that they needed to, and that's it, contain the incident. Because the only reason they were even going on site to get the artifacts that were available is because one of the things that this time factor aspect is important to remember about is attackers at this level like to clean up after themselves once they finished with their objectives. They don't want to leave evidence of what payloads they used, what methodology they used, what techniques they used, and a lot of that is found in the telemetry that's collected, is found in the artifacts that they leave on hosts. So that's one of the main advantages to IR being able to work more closely at the level that attack detection is, because we collect, like you saw in the first case study, we collect artifacts regardless of whether we're going to need them or not, based on the probability that we're going to need them. So taking in the worst case scenario, and then gathering all the resources that we need just in case. Now, incident response doesn't always have that opportunity. The attackers don't always have the opportunity, because if it's a fight between the two. Like if you let them get to the objective, they're going to clean up, and they got the opportunity to clean up. You didn't get the opportunity to get the data. If you stop them before their objective, you get to collect the data, and they don't get to clean it up, in a sense. So it's like that's the give and take that's involved in those situations. Now, I forgot my train of thought. Right. So the reason I mentioned this last is because as we're going to go to the purple teaming part of the talk, you can start to see how like the similarities between incident response and attack detection. What we're going to go to next, and the offensive aspects. So the things that attackers are doing. Now, when you bring all this together, you've basically got purple teaming, which is offensive and defensive at the same time. The thing is, you don't get experience and you don't get to learn from these things unless you're dealing with these incidents as they happen. And as I've said, they don't happen often enough. Your limiting factor at that stage is how often can you be investigating these incidents, and how often can you do it in this manner, right? You can train yourself, you can read books, you can, try and read up on, reports that are done like after the fact, but when you're actually doing it in the moment, you gain information which you don't otherwise. So, one of the main ways that I've come to have the ability to gain this experience is when this sort of sophisticated attack is done as a red team exercise. And one of the main differences that you benefit from is that you allow the attack to be carried out all the way to the end. which means you gain visibility to later parts of the kill chain that you don't usually do if you do your job right? If with attack detection, if you're really effective, over time, I've noticed that you don't get to see a lot of the cool stuff because you're already stopping it before it happens. And so it starts to become rather boring seeing the same, first steps of an attack over and over again without being able to see the whole thing. You can only think about it or anticipate it, but you don't actually get to see it. And so you don't get the chance to learn. Now with the red team exercise, I found the opportunity to let the attack go through, work with the client to actually enable the red team to do as much as they want to. The problem with that is that for those of you who work in the red team industry, you'll know that red teamers have their own limitations. So when they go in to do an engagement, they'll have a certain set of objectives, they'll have a scope for their engagement, and they can't go beyond that, right? So an attacker doesn't have that limitation. They'll try anything and everything to get to their objective, right? But with the red teams, they're not able to do that. So even in the case where you're able to let an attacker go through all the way to the end, you're only seeing a very small subset of what could be. And so again, it's another limiting factor on what you can learn and your level of expertise that you're able to put forth, whether you have it or not. It's like you can't even test it. You can't even benchmark yourself against these things. So my main frustration with that has been to do with the fact that it's a limiting factor, and at some point you hit that ceiling and you can't learn anymore. So over the past year, one of my main projects was to create an attack and defense simulation lab in-house at Countercept, so that all the different teams that work, whether it's IR, whether it's the compromise assessment guys, the attack detection team, the cyber defense guys who go in and do assessments of company securities and give them recommendations. A lot of the work that they do is very separate from what we do. It's the same skill set, it's the same knowledge, but it's a completely different application. But finding a way to bring those things together is key, because you completely remove the limiting factors that I just mentioned. And in fact, the possibilities are rather endless, because once this project was finished, we started to gain progress and results in a way that we haven't in the past. And as far as I can tell, this is not something that's a standard in the industry. It's a mindset that certain people have. It's definitely not something that's being done in all companies, but the best companies are starting to do it at some level, which is the fact that they're recognizing that they need the key to it is to have a shared environment where they can run attacks against the defensive stack that they have, so they can create a direct feedback loop between the two. The thing is, that requires you to start learning how to run attacks. You can't. It's very hard to have a different team or a different service trying to do it, because the communication channels and the reality of how to share that information is very limited. The best way I found to do it is to actually go down the route of learning how to do it yourself. And there's an incredible advantage to that. And you find yourself being able to go beyond the limitations of your own role and gain experience that's very valuable. So the idea is to train like you fight. So you do active defensive engagements on red teams, so like the red team exercises. You do exercises where you have blue and red working together, which is, they know exactly what the red team is doing. They're putting up their solution to bypass them, and then the red team is doing the same to the blue team. And you're doing blind targeted attack simulations, which is more similar to the red team exercises, where you don't know what's going to come. You just know that it's coming. But like I said, the main advantage is that you're learning these attack techniques yourself and you're testing them. The thing that I said about some of these companies that are already doing this, the thing is they're doing it in production, as far as I can tell. They're not doing it in a separate environment. The limiting factor there is that you have to take into consideration all the ways in which your testing is going to affect your production environment. And there's horror stories about how a good intentioned, security specialist was trying to do some of this, and then inadvertently caused, a critical asset to go down, or to affect it in a way that they didn't anticipate. Because once you go down this route, you're doing something which you don't have experience in, and you're doing it for a very specific purpose, but you have to understand what the risks are. So this is why I mentioned that once I realized this, I worked on creating a simulation environment in-house that's separate from production. It's its own environment, because there you're in a safe environment where you can run these things in a completely safe way, and you can let loose, basically. So the idea is to have the ability to create an abstraction layer from your production environment, basically mirror it, and have a version of it that is completely separate, but which you can test as close to reality as possible, because it's mirroring your exact environment. And from what I found is that gaining the experience on all the different variety of estates that are out there is probably the hardest part of all this, because, as I'm going to go into the simulation lab that we put together, you can start very simple with a few endpoints, a couple of servers, different open source tools. But the fact is, every company, you never find an estate that exactly resembles another one. They're all going to be different and have their own characteristics. So having exposure to what these look like is an advantage that attackers have. They're looking to exploit as many estates as they can. From a defender's perspective, your responsibility is usually to look after the one that you have between your hands, and that's it. So how do you get exposure to other estates and take into account the possibilities of how those environments are exploited? So that comes into how you structure the simulation environment, and we're going to touch on that next. But just so you understand the relationship between all the things we've talked about so far and how it relates to purple teaming and the purpose for which we're trying to do all of this, is that purple training improves threat hunting. So at the purple training level, you're doing offensive related things, you're doing defensive related things. That improves threat hunting, because when you're hunting for threats, you're not necessarily looking to detect attacks live. You're looking for things which are unknown, and you're proactively looking for them, so that you can further your understanding of what attacks are out there, because until you find them, you don't know about them. So the only way to be good at threat hunting is to have an understanding of both the offensive and defensive side, which is why I have the two different kill chains here. And then threat hunting itself improves attack detection, because whatever you learn from the threat hunting process, you can feed that back into your attack detection stack, into the people that do attack detection. Their experience means that when they're dealing with an incident, they don't have to, wonder about what is happening on the estate based on what they're seeing. As soon as they see something, they can sort of play out all the different variations of what could be happening next and how it happened in the first place. And that's a very tangible thing that you recognize when you have people that are able to do this. The way in which an investigation goes and how fast you can complete it and how effective you are at containing an incident is completely different. So again, that's why we're trying to find a way to emulate this, so that you can do this constantly, and you can constantly improve yourself and constantly learn without having to limit yourself with the instance that you're actually covering. And then attack detection improves incident response, because like I said, incident response doesn't have to limit itself to operating post-incident and post-mortem, so to speak. They can operate much more closely to how an attack detection team works, but they're actually embodying everything above, which is taking the principles which allowed attack detection to become better in the first place, which is to actually understand attackers' methodologies and the offensive knowledge that's involved, and making that part of incident response, which is not something that you see. You find someone who's in forensics investigation, and they have a specific skill set that's used for a specific purpose, and outside of that, they rely on just giving their results to the next person to make use of it, which if you reverse engineer that and you actually take into account the offensive knowledge that's involved, the the incident response investigations that I see now are completely different than what they used to be. So just thought I'd mention that. Now, one of the main ways in which that applies is that in recent months, one of the things that our incident response team has loved to do, and it's actually been made popular by the head of the incident response at Countercept, is that what they do is they go into an estate, whether it's post-incident or pre-incident, and they'll actually start doing attack path mapping the same way that the attackers do. And I've just used that as an example because I'm running out of time here, but the essential thing that you need to remember is that they don't have compromise assessment experience. They're not red teamers, right? So an interesting example that we came across was when they tried to use Bloodhound to do the attack path mapping. They were trying to identify all the possible paths that were available on a given estate, and then once they've identified them, they work on eliminating those paths until there's none left over. But one of the consultants that was working on this had never used Bloodhound before, and the first time he ran a query, he got something like this, which is a rather simple query, which doesn't give you much information apart from the fact that all these users are part of this group. And so you can do whatever you can with this group, but that's it. You don't get any more context around it. And he was wondering, okay, I've got this tool. It's supposed to do all these things. Why is it not giving me all the results that I'm supposed to see? And one of the red team guys came along and looked at him like he was the most simple answer in the world. He's like, you're not running the query correctly. And once he did, he got something like this. Now, compared to the first query, this is rather overwhelming because this is so much more information. So where do you even start? And the reason behind the difference between the two queries is actually how long he was running the session loop for the query that he was doing. So he was trying to see what the relationships between the users in different groups were and what machines they were related to. But if you're only running the query for 5 minutes, it's only catching whatever is present in those 5 minutes. If you let it run continuously, it's going to start building up the information to where whatever relationship is picking up in that 5 minutes, it's looking at the next hop in the next 5 minutes and then building up everything that you see here. Now, like I said, this was overwhelming as well, but the experience that came from someone who does this regularly looked something like this, where they took the same information, but they basically picked out a specific scenario that they were interested in, a specific path that got them to domain admin, and they didn't go beyond it, and they didn't go any further than this, and they didn't go any less. They picked out one path that gave access to 2 hosts and got them to their objective. Now, if you think about the goal of why you're doing this, you're trying to eliminate this path. You can fix whatever is causing this path to be open, close it down, and now run the sessions again, and the information is no longer in this scope, right? And you can start working on the next one. Now, this is a sort of experience, it's just an example of what's involved in using the tools that attackers are using, having a certain level of expectation on what you're supposed to gain from it. But the reality is you need to experience this yourself. You need to use it the same way an attacker is doing. And the only way you can do that is to actually have an environment in which you're allowed to do it safely, and in which you have full control of how the environment is set up. So this is why we have the detection lab. So like I said, I've worked on having one developed in-house, but that's not something that you're able to share with the community. So I started looking at what's out there, and I'm going to credit someone in particular when I finish here in a few minutes. But this specific lab, which we're going to be sharing and making open source at some point, the objective from it was to have a single script that automates the setup of a threat detection environment, because one of the main pieces of feedback that I've received when talking about all the open source tools that are out there that allow you to learn about this stuff and do it for yourself, the main issue that people were having was, one, understanding how they could implement that into their own estate and start doing it themselves. And that's where the problem of doing things in production versus having a separate environment comes in. So it's important to understand that. The other thing is that actually going through the building process needs you to understand how to use these tools and how to configure them, which takes a lot of time and is a barrier to entry. It's a second barrier to entry to doing this stuff. So the goal is to have as many variations of these labs as possible out there, which are based on, people's understanding of or exposure to different estates, so that you can, replicate those estates and play on them like in a playground, right? So this one in particular is pretty simple. Like I said, there's not a lot of it out there. The main, these are some of the, it's just a list of an example of who might be using it, just to give you the spectrum of different sort of people that might be using it and why. I won't go through it, but I'll let you read the slides after it if you need to, just so I can finish the talk here. But the overall structure of it looks something like this, where you have a given attacker box, you have endpoint machines, you have a server. The goal is to forward as much data and telemetry as you can to a central repository server. The main thing you're going to be using for that is Sysmon. You're using Windows event forwarding policies, all things which I've spoken about before and people understand. But like I said, the main question I was getting asked was, can you give me something that actually is already built, or at least understand how it's put together, all these different pieces are put together, so I can, put it onto my estate and actually do this. The thing which is parsing and collecting all the data is the Elastic Stack. And for the network side of things, you're using Bro to ship all the logs. And at that point, you've got endpoint data, you've got network data, and you've got all the logs that you need to start looking at the data that's generated from the attacks that you're performing. So you can see how powerful that is, because now there's no limitations on what attacks you can run. If you see something out there that's being done, you replicate it, you run the attack, you see what data is being generated, and then you can start working on, coming up with your own ways of writing rules to catch it, or start coming up with use cases, or even gaining the experience of seeing what it looks like, and how long it's going to take you to, in a real world scenario, how long it would take you to recognize those things and then respond to them, right? Those things can only be done in this sort of environment. So, I'm not going to have time to demo the lab now. Maybe I can show a quick running of it, but can you see that? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I'll just go back to the last slide. So, can that take me? I'm going to have to go through all of them now. In any case, the point here, like I said, is that we're going to be releasing this soon on our Countercept GitLab. The one I wanted to credit right before I finish is the lab that was created by Chris Long, and he's, as far as I can tell, he's the first one who put together this sort of environment, and it's available right now for you to play with. I will say that the building process, while it's made to be easy, you still need to try out and trial and error some of the things so you can get used to it. But I definitely wanted to credit him, because he realized the exact same things that we were talking about, and put something out there that he was using personally for the community to use. And I want to sort of encourage people to take this sort of thing and, build it the way they want to, and then put it back out to the community. Because variation is key. It's how we can replicate as many environments as possible. So we as a community have exposure to, playing in environments that replicate real world estates, and we can learn from them and learn as much as possible from them. So I'm going to finish the talk here. So just as a conclusion, you're the best asset in play at all times, not necessarily the technology. And hopefully, like the examples that I used, demonstrate that to some level. Better attack detection is pushing instant response up the defensive kill chain, so they're not operating in the old way that they are. They're operating during an attack now, and that looks very different from what it used to. Understanding the kill chains that you have to deal with is essential, and the techniques that are involved in each one. But the way that you can action on that understanding and that awareness is to actually have access to simulating environments. And hopefully I've given you some options for that. And the main thing I want you to take away is the purpose behind wanting to use these sort of environments. So when you go back to your company, if you have the opportunity to put these into your estates and run them, then please do. At the very least, look at what's out there in terms of open source content and contribute to it. And yeah, simulate all the things. And I'm going to stop it here. Sorry for going over time. And if I can, if any of you want to speak to me after this, I can definitely carry this on with a conversation with you afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ryan. And of course, if Ryan will be here for both days, so do feel free to catch him for the demo or any other questions off the stage.